Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Tonight we're diving into something darker than usual. A story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome. So get comfortable, maybe grab some tea, and before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's darkest corners. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world for these midnight history sessions. Now let me tell you about the most twisted honor system ever created. Picture this. You're 10 years old, playing with a doll, laughing with your sister, normal kid stuff. Then a finger points at you. A man in white robes, face like stone, and suddenly, your mother is sobbing, not tears of joy, tears of horror. This one, 2 words, and your life as you know it, over. Congratulations, you've just been chosen as a Vestal Virgin. Sounds prestigious, right? Wrong. You're about to become Rome's most sacred prisoner. For 30 years, you'll tend a fire that can never die. Break one rule, just one, and they'll bury you alive. This isn't about religious devotion. This is about the most elaborate system of psychological torture ever disguised as divine honor. Ready to see how twisted civilization can really get? Captio. That's what Romans called it. Not selection, not choosing. Capture. Think they were being subtle about what was really happening here? You're 8 years old, forums buzzing with festival energy, vendors shouting, kids running. You're probably picking at your tunic, bored out of your mind. Then, silence. Like someone sucked all the sound out of the world. The crowd parts, and there he is, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's head priest, the man who decides who lives and who gets buried alive. His eyes are scanning, hunting. What's he looking for? Girls aged 6 to 10. Check. Both parents alive. Check. No scars, no imperfections. Check. Born from a proper marriage, because apparently passion makes you spiritually contaminated. Check. But here's what'll make your skin crawl. Some families actually volunteered their daughters. Wait. What? That's right. Parents would literally offer up their children, not from divine calling, from debt, from politics, from wanting one less mouth to feed. Take her, they'd whisper. She'll bring us honor. Honor. Sure. Let's call systematic psychological destruction honor. The selection process, pure psychological warfare. Picture 20 little girls in white robes, all trembling, all trying not to cry. The Pontifex Maximus walks between them like he's shopping for livestock, lifts a chin here, checks teeth there, tests their voices. Say Vesta. Louder. Again. Some get dismissed instantly. Too short. Wrong family. Slightly crooked finger. Others? They get the stare. Long, terrifying minutes while he decides if they're pure enough to destroy. Then comes the moment. The ivory staff rises, points, and that little girl's world explodes into pieces. No goodbye hugs, no last night at home. She's led away immediately, walking through streets where people reach out to touch her robes for luck. Ironic, right? They're blessing themselves with the clothes of a child whose life just ended. Here's the twisted part. These girls will become some of the most powerful people in Rome. They can own property, make wills, even pardon criminals. But that power, it comes with a price that'll break them completely. They're not people anymore. They're symbols, living, breathing representations of Rome's moral purity. And symbols, well, symbols don't get to be human. But wait, it gets so much worse. Because once that child crosses the threshold of the temple, she enters a world designed to systematically destroy everything that makes her who she is. The Atrium Vestae sounds grand, doesn't it? Marble columns, peaceful gardens, fountains that sing in the afternoon sun. Beautiful prison is still a prison. Our 10-year-old walks through those doors once. Just once. Because the girl who enters isn't the same person who might emerge 30 years later. If she emerges at all. The hierarchy hits her immediately. 6 women in white, arranged by seniority like a ladder she'll spend decades climbing. At the top, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, the chief Vestal, a woman who survived her 30 years and chose to stay rather than face a world she no longer understands. At the bottom, our little girl, terrified, alone, about to learn what sacred duty really means. Let me walk you through her first day. Dawn. No gentle mother's voice calling her awake. Just the sound of prayers echoing off marble walls, cold and impersonal as the stones themselves. She tries to get dressed. Remember, she's maybe 8 years old. The stola is complicated. Layers of white linen that wrap and fold in specific ways. The suffibulum veil goes over her head just so. The ritual fillets in her hair mark her as sacred property. She gets it wrong. Of course she does. She's a child. An older Vestal corrects her. Not gently, not with patience. With the cold efficiency of someone who's forgotten what kindness feels like. Again. The child tries. Wrong. Again. Her little fingers shake as she attempts the complex wrapping for the 3rd time. Pathetic. Watch. No comfort. No understanding. Just the crushing weight of expectations she can never meet. Breakfast is silent. Bread, olives, watered wine. She's hungry, probably hasn't eaten since yesterday. But talking during the morning meal is forbidden. Around her, the older Vestals move like ghosts. Efficient. Mechanical. Their faces empty of anything resembling joy or spontaneity. This is her future. This is what she'll become. Then comes her education. And this is where the true scope of what's been stolen from her becomes clear. Normal Roman girls learn household management, how to spin wool into thread, thread into cloth, how to manage slaves, balance household accounts, prepare meals that won't kill anyone. Maybe reading if they're lucky, basic literacy to manage family correspondence, skills for being wives and mothers, for having a life. Vestal Virgins. They learn things that would give you nightmares. They learn to read omens in the flight of birds, which direction they fly, how high, whether they call out or remain silent. Each pattern supposedly reveals the god's will about everything from military campaigns to harvest seasons. They examine sacrificial animals for divine signs. Picture a 12-year-old girl, hands deep in the still warm entrails of a freshly killed sheep, searching for abnormalities in the liver that might indicate divine displeasure. The texture of organs between her fingers, the smell of blood filling her nostrils, the weight of knowing that her interpretation could influence whether Rome goes to war. All while maintaining that serene, otherworldly expression that marks her as sacred. They learn to identify herbs with deadly precision. Which ones heal wounds, reduce fever, ease childbirth pain? Which ones cause hallucinations, paralysis, or death so subtle it looks like natural illness? This knowledge makes them valuable and dangerous. A Vestal who knows poisons is someone who could theoretically eliminate enemies, or herself if the pressure becomes unbearable. They learn ritual purification techniques that involve procedures designed to verify and maintain their physical purity. Examinations that are invasive, humiliating, and deeply traumatic for children who barely understand what's happening to their own bodies. But most disturbingly, they learn the protocols for their own potential execution. Picture this: a 12-year-old girl, still crying herself to sleep because she misses her mother's voice, being taught step by step how to conduct herself if accused of breaking her vows, how to walk with dignity to her own burial, what prayers to recite before they seal her underground, how to arrange her burial clothes, what her final meal should consist of. The instructor's voice is clinical, detached, as if she's explaining how to perform any other religious ritual. If you are ever charged with incestum, the older Vestal explains in that dead monotone, you must not weep. Tears indicate guilt, or worse, unseemly attachment to life. You must not plead. Begging shows spiritual weakness. You must accept the judgment of the pontiffs with perfect serenity. The child nods solemnly, not truly understanding that she's being taught how to participate in her own murder with grace. They practice the walk, the proper pace. Not too fast, which would seem eager for death. Not too slow, which might appear reluctant. The correct posture, back straight, head high, eyes forward. The appropriate expression, calm, accepting, ethereally detached from earthly concerns. They rehearse the descent into the burial chamber, how to step down carefully so as not to trip on their robes, where to place their hands, how to turn for one final look at the sky before the stones block it out forever. It's choreographed psychological torture, disguised as spiritual preparation. Picture this: a 12-year-old girl, still crying herself to sleep some nights because she misses her mother, being taught how to conduct herself if accused of breaking her vows, how to walk to her own burial, what prayers to say before they seal her underground. The casual cruelty of it is breathtaking. If you are ever charged with incestum, the older Vestal explains in that dead monotone voice, you must not weep, you must not plead, you must accept the judgment of the pontiffs with dignity. A child nods solemnly, not truly understanding that she's being taught how to die with grace. The isolation is designed to be complete. No close friendships. Emotional attachments interfere with sacred duties. No pets. Caring for animals is a distraction. No mirrors except for religious preparations. Vanity is sinful. The grinding, repetitive nature of their daily routine isn't accidental. It's psychological conditioning with surgical precision. Let me walk you through what a typical day actually looks like for these women. 4 a.m. Wake to the sound of bronze bells echoing through marble corridors. No gentle stirring, no gradual emergence from sleep, just the harsh clang of metal on metal, designed to jolt them into immediate alertness. The floors are cold, always cold. Marble doesn't hold warmth, and heating such a large complex is expensive. Their feet hit stone that feels like ice, even in summer. 4:15 a.m. Dawn ablutions. Not the comfortable morning routine of washing your face and brushing your teeth. Ritual cleansing that involves specific prayers for each body part, performed in exact sequence. They can't just splash water on their faces. Every gesture has religious significance. Touch forehead while reciting prayers to Jupiter. Wash hands while invoking Vesta's protection. Rinse mouth while asking for purity of speech. One forgotten prayer, one gesture out of sequence, and they have to start over. 4:45 a.m. Dressing. Remember, these are complex religious garments that must be arranged precisely. The stola has specific folds. The veil must be positioned at exact angles. The ritual fillets in their hair have to be wound in patterns that haven't changed for centuries. A senior Vestal inspects each woman before she's allowed to leave her cell, adjusts a fold here, reties a sash there. The inspection isn't gentle guidance. It's military precision applied to religious costume. 5:30 a.m. Morning prayers in the temple. Not personal, private communion with the divine. Formal recitation of texts that must be pronounced with absolute accuracy. Mispronounce a single syllable, and the entire prayer becomes invalid. All 6 Vestals have to start the sequence again. So if one woman stumbles over a word because she's tired, hungry, or distracted, everyone suffers. This creates peer pressure that's almost unbearable. Make a mistake, and you're not just failing yourself. You're ruining it for everyone. 6:30 a.m. Tending the sacred fire. This isn't casually adding logs to a fireplace. Each piece of wood must be examined, blessed, and placed with ceremonial precision. The flame can never be allowed to die, but it also can't be allowed to grow too large or too small. Too big might indicate divine anger. Too small might suggest the goddess is withdrawing her favor. The Vestal on fire duty spends hours watching flame patterns, adjusting fuel, interpreting every flicker and spark for religious significance. Her eyes water from staring into the fire. Her back aches from bending over the altar. Her hands become permanently stained with soot and oils. 8 a.m. Breakfast. Silent. Always silent. They sit in assigned positions around a marble table, eating the same foods in the same order every day. Bread torn into specific-sized pieces. Olives consumed in groups of 3. Wine mixed with water in proportions that vary based on their rank and the religious calendar. No conversation, no laughter, no human connection. Just the sound of chewing, swallowing, and ceramic cups being placed precisely back on the table. 9 a.m. Sacred water preparation. This involves walking to specific springs throughout the city, drawing water in silver vessels and carrying it back to the temple. Sounds simple? It's not. The vessels are heavy, designed to require 2 hands, so the Vestal can't touch anything else while carrying them. The routes are prescribed. They must take specific paths, make specific stops, recite specific prayers at designated locations. The water must not be jostled, spilled, or contaminated by contact with anything profane. If a Vestal trips and drops even a few drops, the entire journey must be repeated. 11 a.m. Preparation of mola salsa, the sacred salt cake that requires hours of backbreaking labor. First, grinding grain. Not with modern machinery, but with heavy stone wheels turned by hand. The Vestal stands in the same position, arms working the same motions, for hours at a time. Her shoulders scream. Her lower back develops a permanent ache. Her hands become raw from gripping the stone handles. The grain must be ground to exact consistency, fine enough to pass through silk cloth, but not so fine that it becomes powder. Test batches are examined by senior Vestals with the scrutiny of military inspectors. Too coarse? Start over. Too fine? Start over. Slightly uneven texture. Start over. 2 p.m. meal preparation. Not for themselves, Vestals eat simple, prescribed foods. This is for the elaborate banquets served during religious festivals. They prepare food they'll never taste, using recipes they'll never enjoy at their own tables. Exotic spices that cost more than most Romans earn in a year. Delicate pastries that require precise techniques and perfect timing. They cook for crowds of hundreds while knowing they'll eat bread and olives in silence. 4 p.m. Weaving ceremonial cloths. Hours of sitting in the same position, fingers working tiny stitches, eyes straining in lamplight. The cloths are used once and then destroyed in religious ceremonies. Days of meticulous work burned in minutes. Their fingers develop permanent calluses. Their vision suffers from years of close work. Their spines curve from hunching over looms. 6 p.m. Evening prayers. More formal recitation, more opportunities for mistakes that ruin everyone's efforts. 8 p.m. Final fire tending, ensuring the flame is properly banked for the night, with enough fuel to last until dawn, but not so much that it might flare dangerously. 9 p.m. Return to cells, not bedrooms, cells. Small, austere spaces with narrow beds, no decoration, no personal possessions. They lie in darkness, listening to the sounds of a city living normal lives just beyond their walls. Laughter from taverns, conversations between friends, children playing in the streets, all the human connections they've been denied. This routine repeats every single day for 30 years. No weekends, no vacations, no sick days. No variation except for the specific prayers and rituals that change with the religious calendar. Imagine living like this. Imagine being 8 years old and realizing this is your entire future. They become what the system needs them to be: compliant, passive, broken. And if they start to crack under the pressure, if they show signs of depression, anxiety, or psychological distress, that's not seen as evidence that the system is cruel. It's seen as proof of their holiness. Look how she suffers for the gods, Romans would whisper admiringly. See how the divine spirit moves through her. The more obviously miserable these women were, the more virtuous Rome felt about the whole arrangement. But here's what really gets under your skin. Many of them internalized this abuse so completely that they became its most enthusiastic enforcers. The older Vestals, broken by decades of psychological control, would police the younger ones with ruthless efficiency. They'd forgotten what it felt like to be human, and they were determined that the girls under their care would forget too. It's textbook trauma response. When you can't escape your abuser, sometimes the only way to survive is to become them. And through it all, these women had to maintain that serene expression, that otherworldly calm that Romans interpreted as divine contentment. Smile while you're being tortured. Look peaceful while your soul is being systematically destroyed. Because you're not a person anymore. You're a performance. The eternal flame of Vesta wasn't just a religious symbol. It was a psychological weapon pointed directly at 6 women's hearts. Imagine this. You're responsible for a fire that can never, ever go out. Not during thunderstorms that shake the temple walls. Not during the chaos of civil war when blood runs in the streets. Not in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn when exhaustion makes your hands shake. If that fire dies, Rome dies. At least that's what everyone believes. And belief, as we know, can kill. The pressure is crushing. You're not just tending a flame. You're holding the life force of an entire civilization in your trembling hands. Millions of people are counting on you to never make a mistake, never have a moment of inattention, never be human. How's that for job security? The rituals around the fire are elaborate torture disguised as sacred duty. The wood has to be specific types: oak for strength, apple for purity, cherry for divine favor, cut at certain times of year, dried for exact periods, blessed with prayers that must be letter perfect. One mispronounced syllable, start over. One wrong gesture, start over. One moment of distraction, start over. And if, despite all your care, all your vigilance, all your desperate prayers, if that flame somehow goes out, the punishment is swift and brutal. The Vestal on duty gets stripped and beaten with rods in complete darkness, not as penalty exactly, as purification, because the fire's failure means she's spiritually contaminated. Picture a 19-year-old woman discovering that the flame she's tended for hours has somehow died. Maybe the wind shifted. Maybe the wood was slightly damp. Maybe she miscounted the seconds between feedings. In that moment of realization, her blood turns to ice because she knows what's coming. The beating happens immediately, before the fire can be rekindled. She's taken to a sealed chamber, stripped of her sacred robes, and whipped by the Pontifex Maximus himself, while priests hold lamps at a distance. Just enough light for the punishment. Not enough to clearly see her nakedness. The Romans were very concerned about preserving her modesty while they were beating her raw. She can't cry out. That would be undignified. She can't beg for mercy. That would show weakness. She has to stand there in the darkness, feeling the rods tear her skin, maintaining that serene expression that marks her as divinely chosen. Then, bloody and shaking, she has to rekindle the fire using traditional methods. Rubbing dry wood together until sparks catch. Building the flame back to proper size. Her hands are trembling from pain and shock. Her back is screaming with every movement. But she has to perform this delicate task with the same precision and reverence as always. Because she's not allowed to be human. Not even in her agony. But the fire is just one aspect of their impossible duties. They're also responsible for preparing mola salsa, sacred salt cake used in all major Roman sacrifices. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. First, they harvest grain themselves on specific days, cutting it with iron sickles while reciting prayers. Every motion must be precise, every word perfect. Then comes winnowing, hours of separating chaff from grain by hand. Every piece of chaff removed, every imperfect kernel discarded. The grinding is back-breaking work. Heavy stone wheels turned by hand until their arms scream and their backs curve permanently. Hour after hour until the grain becomes flour fine enough to pass the most rigorous inspection. The salt comes from a sacred spring, gathered in silver vessels used for no other purpose, evaporated using methods unchanged for centuries. The mixing process can take days. Proportions must be exact. Stirring must follow precise patterns. Prayers must be recited without a single error. One mistake, one slightly irregular movement, one mispronounced word, and the entire batch gets discarded. Start over. And here's the cruelest part. This sacred salt cake that requires such incredible effort and precision gets used once and then burned completely. Hours and hours of backbreaking labor for something that exists only to be destroyed. The Vestals make dozens of these cakes every year. Their hands become permanently stained from the salt. Their backs permanently curved from bending over grinding stones. They also prepare sacred water for purification rituals, drawing it from specific springs at exact times, filtering it through layers of cloth, blessing it with prayers that must be perfect. They weave ceremonial ribbons used to decorate sacrificial animals, tiny, perfect stitches worked by lamplight, because this work is too sacred for ordinary daylight. Every task surrounded by countless taboos. Can't use iron tools on certain days. Can't wear particular colors during specific months. Can't eat various foods depending on the season and their position in the hierarchy. The list of rules governing their daily lives is enormous and constantly changing based on omens, dreams, and the whims of the Pontifical College. Through it all, they have to radiate divine contentment. Can't complain about the work. Can't question the necessity of the rules. Can't show signs of fatigue or frustration. They're living advertisements for the benefits of total submission to the God's will. But what happens when that mask slips? When a Vestal shows signs of being human rather than divine? That's when Rome reveals its true face. A Vestal Virgin's body isn't her own. It belongs to Rome, to the goddess, to the abstract concept of imperial virtue. Every inch of her flesh is subject to scrutiny that would make a modern totalitarian state seem relaxed. The vow of chastity isn't just about avoiding relationships. It's about never being allowed to exist as a complete human being. Intimate gets defined so broadly it becomes meaningless. Can't dance with a man at festivals, too sensual. Can't accept gifts from men's hands. Their fingers might brush. Can't be alone with any man unless witnesses are present. This creates a nightmare for basic needs like medical care. Vestal gets sick. The male physician can't examine her directly. She has to describe symptoms while standing behind a curtain. Point to areas of concern on a cloth doll. Surgery? Virtually impossible unless she's unconscious. And even then, female assistants have to supervise to ensure appropriate boundaries. Dental care is particularly horrific. Toothaches are common in ancient Rome. The usual treatment involves probing infected areas with metal instruments. But a Vestal can't open her mouth for a male dentist without raising questions about symbolic purity. Many just endure the pain until their teeth rot completely. The psychological effects are devastating. These women develop severe touch starvation, a condition that causes depression, anxiety, even hallucinations. Ancient sources describe Vestals who stroke their own arms compulsively, who press their faces against cool marble walls just to feel something against their skin, who faint during ceremonies from the overwhelming sensation of accidental contact in crowds. But it's not just romantic contact that's forbidden. Vestals can't hug family members during visits, can't comfort crying children by holding them, can't even touch their sister Vestals in moments of grief without raising suspicions. Their biological functions get monitored like state secrets. Menstrual cycles tracked and recorded. Too irregular might indicate illness. Too regular might seem suspiciously connected to secret meetings. These women can't even have normal bodily functions without them being interpreted as spiritual indicators. Their diets are controlled to suppress natural desires. Certain spices forbidden because they increase passion. Meat limited because it might make them too robust. Wine rationed, enough to avoid suspicion, not enough to lower inhibitions. Clothing regulations extend to the smallest detail. White, always white. But the specific style and arrangement dictated by hundreds of rules. How they tie sashes, length of veils, position of jewelry, all prescribed. Can't adjust for comfort. Can't adapt to weather. Can't express any personal preference. Hair is perhaps the most controlled aspect. On installation day, each new Vestal's hair gets cut and arranged in a specific style unchanged for centuries. This isn't about uniformity. It's about erasing individual identity. Hair represents femininity and personal expression, so it has to be minimized and controlled. Any change in appearance can be interpreted as evidence of moral corruption. Lose weight, and people whisper about forbidden love. Gain weight, and they suspect pregnancy. Develop a skin condition, and it might be divine punishment for impure thoughts. Medical ignorance makes it worse. Normal adolescent acne gets interpreted as spiritual impurity. Headaches might indicate divine displeasure. Even nosebleeds can spark investigations. The Vestals learn to hide any signs of physical distress. They develop techniques for suppressing coughs during ceremonies, for standing motionless when feeling faint, for maintaining calm expressions even in significant pain. They become experts at dissociation, mentally separating from their bodies to endure constant scrutiny. The cruelest irony? This systematic dehumanization gets presented as honor. Romans point to the pale, ethereal-looking Vestals and say, "See how pure they are. See how they've transcended ordinary human concerns." The more obviously these women suffer, the more virtuous Rome feels. The few who survive their full 30 years are often so psychologically damaged they can't function in normal society. They've been trained so thoroughly to suppress natural human needs that they literally don't know how to exist as complete people. Many choose to remain in Vesta's service rather than face the terrifying prospect of inhabiting their own bodies freely. But what happens when this inhuman system inevitably breaks down? When a Vestal's humanity asserts itself despite all the conditioning? That's when Rome shows its teeth. And those teeth are sharp, stained with blood, and perfectly designed for tearing women apart. The accusations don't start with evidence. They start with whispers, with someone deciding that a particular Vestal has become inconvenient. Maybe she's shown too much independent thought during religious discussions. Maybe her family has fallen out of political favor. Maybe she's simply lived long enough to see too much, know too much, become too confident in her own judgment. The machine of destruction begins with surveillance. Suddenly, every move she makes is watched with new intensity. Every word she speaks is analyzed for hidden meanings. Every expression that crosses her face is interpreted as evidence of guilt. The other Vestals are questioned. Has she seemed different lately? Has she asked unusual questions? Has she shown interest in things beyond her duties? Of course she has. She's human. Humans are curious, emotional, complex creatures. But in the twisted logic of the system, humanity itself becomes evidence of corruption. Her family is investigated. Old political enemies emerge from the shadows with convenient memories of suspicious behavior. Business rivals of her father suddenly recall incidents that seemed innocent at the time, but now appear sinister. The web of accusation spreads like poison through water. Her correspondence is examined. Any letter that shows warmth, affection, or personality is taken as proof of inappropriate emotional attachments. A note thanking a senator for a donation to the temple becomes evidence of a secret relationship. A friendly message to a female cousin is twisted into proof of conspiracies. Her health is scrutinized. Does she look too robust, too happy, too comfortable in her own skin? In a system that equates holiness with visible suffering, contentment becomes suspicious. The questioning begins casually. Senior priests drop by for friendly chats that gradually become interrogations. We've heard some concerning rumors. Nothing serious, of course. Just idle gossip. But we thought you should know what people are saying. They don't reveal the specific accusations at first. They let her imagination fill in the blanks, hoping she'll confess to something, anything, that they can use against her. Perhaps you've been unwise in your friendships, maybe too trusting with certain people. We understand how easy it is for a woman of your position to be taken advantage of. The questions are designed to make her doubt herself, to plant seeds of guilt and confusion, to make her wonder if innocent actions have been misinterpreted, if friendly gestures have sent wrong messages. Sleep becomes impossible. She lies awake replaying every conversation, every interaction, every moment that might have been seen as improper. Did she smile too warmly at that young priest? Did she stand too close to that senator during the ceremony? Did she express too much interest when someone mentioned news from outside the temple? The isolation intensifies. Other Vestals are instructed to limit their interactions with her. Not openly, that would be cruel. Just distance themselves for everyone's protection. Meals become exercises in loneliness. She sits at the same table but might as well be on another planet. Conversations stop when she approaches. Eyes avoid her gaze. She's not accused yet. She's not formally charged, but she's already being treated as guilty. This psychological torture can continue for months. The stress is unbearable. She loses weight, develops insomnia, starts making small mistakes in her religious duties that are immediately noted and recorded as further evidence of her spiritual decline. Her appearance changes. The strain shows in her face, her posture, her movements, and this visible deterioration is used against her. Look at her, the prosecutors will later say. See how guilt has marked her? See how corruption has aged her? The formal investigation, when it finally comes, is almost a relief. At least now she knows what she's fighting. But the fight is rigged from the start. In Rome, reputation is everything. For a Vestal Virgin, reputation is a house of cards built in a hurricane. One whispered rumor, one suspicious glance, one person with a political grudge. That's all it takes to destroy a woman's life entirely. The process usually begins with something absurdly trivial. Maybe a Vestal smiled too warmly at a young patrician during a festival. Maybe she seemed too animated talking with a male relative. Maybe she simply looked healthier than someone thought appropriate. Once the whisper starts, it takes on a life of its own. Romans love gossip the way we love social media drama, and scandal involving the Vestals, that's the juiciest content of all. Did you hear about Vestal Claudia? Someone saw her leaving the temple after sunset. Really? I heard she was meeting someone by the river. No. I was told she's been acting strangely. Too cheerful, too healthy. Well, there was that young senator who lingered after ceremonies. And just like that, a woman's life gets destroyed by pure speculation and entertainment. The investigation process is psychological torture disguised as legal procedure. The College of Pontiffs convenes with grave faces, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence with all the appearance of fairness. But the deck is always stacked. In Roman law, a Vestal's testimony normally carries enormous weight, except when she's defending herself. Then suddenly her word becomes suspect, colored by obvious self-interest. Character witnesses are hard to find. Associating with an accused Vestal can taint your own reputation. The physical examinations are particularly degrading. Panels of older women examine the accused to determine if she's still physically virginal, medically unreliable even by ancient standards. But the examination itself is designed to strip away dignity from someone already facing death. Here's what makes it sinister. These investigations often have nothing to do with actual evidence. They're political weapons for settling scores and advancing careers. Accusing a Vestal of breaking her vows is a way to attack her family's political position, to distract from other scandals, to demonstrate your own moral superiority. Take Minucia, accused in 337 BCE not because anyone saw her with a man, but because she dressed too elegantly and seemed too cheerful. That's right. She nearly died for the crime of not being miserable enough. Or consider the trial of Vestals Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia in 114 BCE. This conveniently occurred during political upheaval when leaders needed scapegoats for military failures. The evidence? Laughably thin. Rumors about secret messages, speculation about nighttime meetings, character assassination disguised as moral concern. One was executed. The others were initially acquitted, only to be retried when their first verdict proved politically inconvenient. The psychological impact on the accused is devastating. From the moment charges are filed, she becomes a non-person, shunned by everyone she's known. Sister Vestals are forbidden from speaking to her except when absolutely necessary. Families often disown accused members publicly to avoid contamination. She eats alone, sleeps in isolation, spends her days in living death while waiting to learn if it becomes literal. This isolation is designed to break her spirit. Romans believe guilty Vestals will eventually confess under pressure of loneliness and despair. Many do confess, not from guilt, but because the psychological torture becomes unbearable. If she confesses, she might be allowed to take her own life rather than face ritual burial. This gets presented as mercy, but it's really just another form of control. The trial itself is often predetermined. The pontiffs aren't seeking evidence of innocence. They're looking for ways to maintain public faith while disposing of someone politically inconvenient. Witnesses are selected to support the prosecution. Evidence is interpreted to support guilt. The accused's behavior during trial, too calm, too emotional, too defiant, too submissive, becomes further proof of corruption. When the verdict comes, it's delivered with expressions of regret, as if the judges had no choice. They say, "The evidence compels us to this tragic conclusion," they say, as if they hadn't manufactured that evidence. Then comes the sentence, delivered in euphemistic language to hide its horror. She won't be executed. That would be barbaric. She'll be given to the earth, returned to the gods, sealed with sacred soil. but everyone knows what those pretty words mean. Everyone knows what waits in the darkness underground. The Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked, lies just outside Rome's sacred boundary. A patch of earth consecrated for one purpose only: the ritualized murder of women whose crime was being human. The condemned Vestal's last day begins with terrible knowledge. She wakes in isolation, moved to a separate chamber to prevent contamination, knowing these are her final hours. Her breakfast is simple: bread, water, perhaps fruit. Not from kindness, but because tradition demands sustenance before her return to the earth. The preparation is designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining religious propriety. She's bathed, likely the first human touch she's experienced in months, and her hair arranged in traditional style. Her skin is anointed with oils, her nails cleaned and trimmed. She's being prepared like a sacrifice, which in every meaningful sense she is. Then comes the ritual dressing, the white robe of her office, the sacred phyllis in her hair, the veil marking her as consecrated. She looks exactly as she did during festivals when Romans reached out to touch her robes for blessings. The same appearance that once brought honor now marks her for death. The procession through Rome is pure theater. She walks through streets where she was once revered, past temples where she performed rituals, past houses where she blessed ceremonies. But now those same people line the streets to watch her die. The crowd's reaction is carefully orchestrated. Public mourning is expected. This is supposedly tragedy, not celebration. Women wail and tear their clothes. Men shake their heads gravely. Children are held up to witness the solemn procession. But underneath the performed grief thrills voyeuristic excitement. Romans love spectacle, and the ritual burial of a Vestal is the ultimate exclusive show. She's been trained for this moment. Part of Vestal education included instruction in proper death should the occasion arise. She's expected to maintain dignity, show neither fear nor defiance, embody the serene acceptance Romans associate with divine wisdom. Any display of human emotion would be taken as further proof of her corruption. The walk to Campus Sceleratus takes about an hour to see faces of people she's served, blessed, devoted her life to protecting. An hour to understand that none of that service matters now. The burial site is unremarkable. A hole in the ground, carefully excavated and lined with stones. But the chamber prepared below is a masterpiece of psychological torture disguised as mercy. It contains everything needed to sustain life: a bed with clean linens, a lamp with oil for light, bread and water for nourishment, even basic necessities for bodily functions. The message is clear. Rome isn't committing murder. Rome is creating circumstances where divine justice can operate. If she's truly innocent, divine intervention will save her. If she dies, it proves her guilt. Elegant, legally clean, absolutely monstrous. The final moments are choreographed with religious precision. She's helped down wooden steps into the chamber. No one can simply push her, because that would constitute murder. She has to descend voluntarily, even if that voluntary action comes under threat of immediate execution above ground. Once at the bottom, the real cruelty begins. The ladder is removed, but the opening isn't sealed immediately. Instead, she's left alone in the chamber, staring up at the square of sky above, listening to sounds of preparation. She can hear scraping shovels, thudding stones being arranged, murmured prayers being recited. She can hear the world continuing above while she waits in the hole that will become her grave. The sealing process is deliberately slow, designed to maximize the psychological torture of the woman below. First, wooden planks are laid across the opening, heavy oak beams that block most of the light, but still allow air to pass through. She can still hear voices above, still catch fragments of conversation as the workers prepare her tomb. She hears the Pontifex Maximus reciting prayers, not for her soul, for the purification of the ground that will hold her body. She's not being mourned. She's being disposed of. The stones come next, each one carefully selected, fitted with precision against its neighbors. The workers take their time, ensuring perfect seal. No gaps, no weaknesses, no possibility of escape. With each stone, the square of sky above her head grows smaller. The light dims by degrees. The air grows more stagnant. She can hear the scraping of metal on stone as the workers use iron tools to position each piece perfectly. The sound echoes off the chamber walls, amplified and distorted until it fills her entire world. Then comes the earth. Shovelful by shovelful, dumped onto the stones with dull, heavy thuds. The sound changes as the pile grows thicker, becoming more muffled, more final. She knows that with each load of dirt, she's being buried more deeply, cut off more completely from the world above. The voices grow fainter, the sounds more distant, until finally, there's nothing but silence. Complete, absolute, suffocating silence. She's alone now. Truly alone. More alone than any human being should ever be. The lamp provides a small circle of light in the darkness, just enough to see the stone walls, the simple furniture, the food and water that will sustain her for a few more days. She tries to calculate how long she has. The oil in the lamp will last perhaps 12 hours if she's careful. The bread might stay edible for 3 days, maybe 4 if she rations it strictly. The water could stretch to a week if she barely allows herself to sip. But the air? That's the unknown variable. How much oxygen is trapped in this sealed chamber? How long before her own breathing uses it up? She might have hours. She might have days. The uncertainty is almost worse than knowing would be. At first, she tries to maintain her composure. She's been trained for this, after all. She knows the prayers she's supposed to recite, the mental exercises that should help her achieve spiritual transcendence. But training and reality are different things. The darkness presses against her like a living thing. She can feel it in her lungs, taste it on her tongue. The silence is so complete that her own heartbeat sounds like thunder. She tries to pray, but the words catch in her throat. How do you pray to a goddess who allowed this to happen? How do you worship a system that's murdering you? Anger comes in waves. Rage at the injustice, at the hypocrisy, at the men who claim to honor her while destroying her. She wants to scream, to beat her fists against the stones, to rage against the darkness. But screaming uses up oxygen. And besides, who would hear her? She tries to remember her childhood, her mother's face, the sound of her father's laugh, the feeling of grass under her bare feet. But the memories feel distant, unreal, like stories someone told her about another person's life. Has she been underground for hours? Days? Time becomes meaningless in absolute darkness. Her internal clock, disrupted by stress and terror, provides no guidance. The oil in the lamp burns lower. The flame flickers, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Soon, even this small comfort will be gone. She conserves the light now, blowing out the flame for long periods and relighting it only when the darkness becomes unbearable. Each time she strikes the flint, she wonders if this will be the last time she'll see anything at all. The food begins to spoil. The bread hardens, then grows moldy. The water develops a stale taste. She forces herself to eat and drink anyway, knowing she'll need strength for whatever's coming. But what is coming? How does this end? She knows the stories, other women who've died this way. But knowing and experiencing are different things. Will she gradually weaken as the air grows thin? Will consciousness fade slowly? Or will there be panic at the end? Will anyone remember her? Will her name be spoken after she's gone? Or will she simply disappear from history like so many others? The lamp finally dies. The last drop of oil consumed. The wick extinguished, leaving her in darkness so complete it seems solid. Now she truly understands the horror of her situation. She's been buried alive, left to die slowly and alone, forgotten by everyone who claimed to love her. The air grows thick and stale. Each breath requires more effort. Her head pounds with the beginnings of oxygen deprivation. She lies on the bed, conserving energy, trying to make her remaining oxygen last as long as possible. But she knows it's futile. In her final hours, she might rage against the injustice, or she might find some peace, some acceptance of her fate. We'll never know. The women who died this way took their final thoughts with them into the darkness. But we know this: they died alone, afraid, and utterly abandoned by the civilization that claimed to cherish them. When it's finally over, Rome waits. The site remains undisturbed long enough to ensure death has occurred, but not so long that decomposition makes the area religiously unclean. Then quietly, workers return to remove stones and fill in the burial chamber permanently. The woman's name is struck from official records. Her possessions are distributed or destroyed. Any mention of her in family records is erased. It's as if she never existed, except for whispered stories about what happens to women who forget their place. And life in Rome continues, protected and purified by this ritual sacrifice to the gods of social order. Let's put faces on this horror. These weren't nameless victims of an abstract system. They were real women with real lives, hopes, and fears that were destroyed by Rome's machinery of sanctified murder. Meet Urbinia, condemned in 483 BCE during one of Rome's earliest recorded Vestal executions. History tells us almost nothing about her as a person. Not her age, not her family background, not even the specific charges against her. But we know she existed because her death was significant enough to record. A precedent that would guide future executions. What we can piece together from political context is chilling. Her death came during social upheaval, when the patrician class was struggling to maintain control against rising plebeian demands. Accusing a Vestal of breaking her vows was a way to demonstrate moral authority, to show that traditional religious hierarchy was strong enough to police its own members. Urbinia died not for anything she had done, but to prove a political point about who held power in Rome. Imagine being her in those final weeks, knowing your death had been decided not by divine judgment, but by men who needed a scapegoat to shore up their authority. Picture walking through the forum where you'd once been revered, now seeing only averted eyes and whispered conversations, lying awake in your cell, wondering if there had been some moment, some choice, some different path that might have saved you. More documented is the case of Opimia and Floronia in 216 BCE, during one of Rome's darkest hours. Hannibal was at the gates. Roman armies were being slaughtered. The city was gripped by religious panic. When military defeats mounted and omens turned ominous, Romans looked for someone to blame. They found the Vestals. Opimia was the older of the two, probably in her 20s, someone who had already served more than a decade in faithful service. The charges against her were vague: inappropriate conduct with men, failure to maintain proper dignity, spiritual corruption, allegedly weakening Rome's divine protection. The evidence was circumstantial at best. She had been seen laughing with a young patrician after a religious ceremony. Her health seemed too robust for someone supposedly sacrificing for the gods. Her family had political enemies who found it convenient to attack her. Floronia was younger, maybe 18 or 19, caught up in the investigation of her older colleague. The accusations against her were even thinner: guilt by association, suspicious behavior never clearly defined, the kind of vague moral corruption that could mean anything. Their responses revealed different personalities and coping strategies. Opimia maintained her innocence throughout, dignified and calm, trusting that truth would eventually prevail. She called character witnesses, pointed to years of faithful service, appealed to evidence of her unstained reputation. Floronia, perhaps more realistic about the political forces arrayed against them, chose differently. Rather than face ritual burial, she took her own life before sentence could be carried out. But even in death, Rome managed to twist her suicide into proof of the charges against her. Why would an innocent woman kill herself? The pontiffs asked, unless she was consumed with guilt over her crimes. Her death became retroactive evidence of her corruption, a confession extracted by shame rather than torture. Opimia, meanwhile, went to her burial still protesting her innocence. Sources describe her maintaining composure even as she descended into the underground chamber, even as stones were fitted over her head. Whether this was genuine serenity, shock-induced dissociation, or simply the final performance of a woman who had spent her life being watched and judged, we'll never know. What we do know is that her name was remembered, which was unusual for condemned Vestals. Usually their identities were erased from official records as part of the punishment. But Opimia's case was recorded by multiple historians, perhaps because her dignity in death was so striking, or perhaps because even her accusers felt some discomfort about what they had done. The most psychologically complex case might be Aemilia in 114 BCE, whose story reveals the impossible double binds that trapped these women. Aemilia was accused not just of breaking her vow of chastity, but of corrupting two younger Vestals, Licinia and Marcia, by introducing them to inappropriate relationships with men. The charges grew out of a political scandal involving several prominent Roman families. Aemilia's supposed lovers included members of the nobility whose own reputations needed protection, so she became the perfect scapegoat, a woman whose death would simultaneously punish sexual transgression and shield powerful men from consequences. But here's what makes her case so tragic. The evidence suggests that if Aemilia was guilty of anything, it was trying to protect the younger women under her care. As the senior Vestal, she was responsible for their education and well-being. If Licinia and Marcia had formed emotional attachments, whether romantic or simply human friendships being misinterpreted, Aemilia might have been trying to shield them from investigation. In Rome's twisted moral universe, this protective instinct became evidence of corruption. Emilia's care for her sister Vestals was reframed as proof that she was leading them astray, that her own spiritual contamination was spreading through the house like disease. The trial records, fragmentary as they are, show a woman caught between impossible choices. If she defended herself vigorously, she was showing unseemly pride and defiance. If she remained passive, she was demonstrating the guilt that rendered her unable to speak. If she tried to protect the younger women, she was proving that she had corrupted them. If she abandoned them to save herself, she was showing the callous self-interest that marked her as spiritually bankrupt. Emilia chose to maintain her dignity and accept her fate. She was buried alive in 114 BCE, but not before witnessing a political circus that revealed the complete cynicism of the system she had served. Licinia and Marcia were initially acquitted when their family's political influence proved strong enough to sway the first trial. But when public opinion demanded more victims, they were retried under a different legal procedure and condemned as well. The most haunting detail from Emilia's case comes from a fragment of testimony that suggests she spent her final weeks trying to prepare the younger women for their fate. She taught them prayers for the dying, showed them techniques for maintaining calm in the face of terror, and helped them write final letters to their families. Even facing her own horrible death, she was still trying to care for others. These weren't monsters or temptresses or women consumed with lust for forbidden pleasures. They were human beings caught in an inhuman system, women who had given their lives to serve a goddess and a state that ultimately devoured them. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales about the dangers of sexual transgression, but as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of institutionalized cruelty. And their deaths served a purpose that had nothing to do with religious purity and everything to do with social control. They reminded every woman in Rome what happened to those who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior, who dared to be fully human in a world that demanded they be something less. So what kind of society creates this nightmare? What lets people convince themselves they're honoring women while torturing them? The answer is going to make you uncomfortable, because it's the same psychology we see today. Rome had a problem. Their entire civilization was built on violence, conquest, slavery, oppression. But they wanted to see themselves as noble, civilized, virtuous. Cognitive dissonance is a hell of a drug. Enter the Vestals. Perfect solution. Look how we honor feminine purity, Romans could say, while systematically destroying these women's humanity. See how we protect them, while imprisoning them for 30 years. The more restrictions they piled on, the more virtuous they felt. It's textbook psychological projection. Take your own guilt and shame, flip it inside out, and make it look like virtue. But it gets worse. The brainwashing started in childhood. 6-year-olds have no memory of life before the temple. Their entire identity gets built around being sacred property. Then comes the isolation. Cut them off from family, friends, any normal human bonds. Make the other Vestals their only source of belonging. Now they can't rebel. Rebellion means losing everything. Not just their role, but their entire sense of self. Classic cult psychology. And Rome perfected it centuries before we had names for these tactics. The surveillance was constant. Every move watched. Every mistake punished. Know what that creates? Learned helplessness. Eventually, they stop trying to assert any control. They become passive, compliant, broken. But here's the most twisted part. The older Vestals became the cruelest enforcers. Why? Because they'd internalized their abuse so completely, they couldn't imagine any other way to exist. If they admitted this system was wrong, they'd have to face that their entire lives had been meaningless suffering. So instead, they made sure the next generation suffered too. The execution ritual itself was designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing conscious awareness of its cruelty. By providing food and water in the burial chamber, Romans could tell themselves they weren't committing murder. They were creating circumstances where divine justice could operate. If the woman was truly innocent, divine intervention would save her. If she died, it proved her guilt. This logic is psychologically appealing because it removes human agency from the equation. The Romans weren't killing anyone. They were facilitating divine judgment. The woman's death wasn't their fault. It was proof of her own corruption. The cruelty of the method, slow suffocation in complete darkness, could be ignored because it was supposedly divinely ordained. The public response to these executions reveals another psychological mechanism: how societies use ritual scapegoating to manage collective anxiety. When Rome faced military defeats, political instability, or social upheaval, accusing and executing Vestals provided a way to discharge collective fear and frustration onto safe targets. The condemned women couldn't fight back, couldn't rally political support, couldn't threaten anyone with retaliation. They were perfect victims, sacred enough that their punishment felt significant, powerless enough that there was no risk in destroying them. Their deaths allowed Romans to feel that they had taken decisive action against the moral corruption that was supposedly causing their problems. The gender dynamics were crucial to this psychological function. In a patriarchal society where women's sexuality was seen as inherently dangerous and disruptive, the Vestals represented the fantasy of completely controlled femininity. When they fell, it confirmed every anxious belief about women's essential unreliability and need for male supervision. But there's another layer that's even more disturbing. The Romans didn't just fear female sexuality, they were fascinated by it. The elaborate rules governing Vestal behavior, the detailed investigations of alleged transgressions, the prurient interest in the physical examinations, all of this suggests a society that was obsessed with the very thing it claimed to be protecting against. The Vestal trials often read like elaborate fantasies disguised as religious proceedings. The accusations were always of a nature that allowed for detailed speculation about women's bodies and behaviors. Romans could indulge their fascination while telling themselves they were acting out of moral outrage. This psychological complexity explains why the Vestal institution lasted for over 1,000 years. It served too many social and psychological functions to be easily abandoned. It provided an outlet for misogyny, a mechanism for political scapegoating, a way to manage collective anxiety about female sexuality, and a ritual space where Romans could act out their deepest fears and fantasies while maintaining a veneer of religious respectability. The women themselves were largely irrelevant to these psychological dynamics. They were props in an elaborate social drama, symbols to be manipulated rather than people to be considered. Their actual thoughts, feelings, and experiences mattered only insofar as they served the broader social functions of the institution. Understanding this psychology doesn't excuse the cruelty, but it does help explain how it could persist for so long and why similar mechanisms continue to operate in different forms throughout human history. The specific details change, but the underlying pattern, using supposedly sacred women as vessels for society's anxieties about sex, power, and social order, remains depressingly consistent across cultures and centuries. The Vestal Virgin institution didn't collapse overnight. Like many ancient traditions, it faded gradually, undermined by changing religious beliefs, political upheaval, and the simple human recognition that no loving deity would demand such cruelty. The beginning of the end came with Christianity's rise in the Roman Empire. Here was a religion that, whatever its other flaws, didn't require the ritual imprisonment and potential murder of young women. Christian writers like Augustine and Jerome were among the first to openly criticize the Vestal system, pointing out the obvious contradiction between Rome's claimed reverence for these women and the brutal treatment they actually received. But change came slowly. The Vestal institution was too deeply embedded in Roman identity to be easily abandoned. It had survived the transformation from kingdom to republic to empire, adapting to new political realities while maintaining its essential character. The sacred fire had burned for more than 1,000 years. Extinguishing it would require more than just theological arguments. The practical decline began in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, as the Roman Empire faced increasing pressures from barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and internal political chaos. Maintaining the elaborate rituals and costly infrastructure of the Vestal cult became increasingly difficult when the state could barely maintain its armies and civil administration. More importantly, the pool of suitable candidates began to dry up. As Roman society became more Christian, fewer families were willing to sacrifice their daughters to serve pagan gods. The legal requirements for Vestal selection, both parents' living, unblemished reputation, proper social status, became harder to meet as traditional Roman family structures broke down under the pressures of the empire's decline. The quality of the Vestals themselves probably declined as well. The most devout and capable young women were increasingly drawn to Christian religious life, which offered many of the same attractions: social status, intellectual development, freedom from marriage and childbearing, without the threat of being buried alive for human failings. The political functions that the Vestal institution had served were also becoming obsolete. In a Christianizing empire, ritual scapegoating of pagan priestesses no longer served the same psychological and social purposes. The new faith provided different mechanisms for managing collective anxiety and different targets for social frustration. Emperor Gratian struck a major blow against the institution in 382 CE when he confiscated the Vestals' property and eliminated their state subsidies. This wasn't presented as an attack on the religion itself, but as a practical economic measure during a time of financial crisis. But without their economic foundation, the Vestals couldn't maintain their temple, support their members, or perform their elaborate rituals. The final end came under Emperor Theodosius I, who in 394 CE formally abolished all pagan religious practices, including the Vestal cult. The sacred fire was extinguished for the last time. The temple was closed, and the remaining Vestals were pensioned off or absorbed into Christian religious communities. But what happened to these women who had devoted their entire lives to a goddess that the state now declared to be a demon? The historical record is frustratingly silent on this point, but we can imagine the psychological devastation of women who had been taught that their entire identity and purpose was tied to rituals that were now forbidden. Some probably converted to Christianity, finding in the new faith a way to maintain their religious identity without completely abandoning their sense of purpose. The Christian emphasis on virginity and spiritual devotion would have been familiar to women who had spent decades practicing similar disciplines. Others might have tried to maintain their old practices in secret, tending hidden flames and performing banned rituals until age and isolation finally made such efforts impossible. There are hints in later Christian writings of former Vestals who became involved in what the Church called witchcraft, probably just the continuation of traditional religious practices that were now criminalized. And some probably just gave up entirely, broken by the recognition that everything they had sacrificed for had been meaningless. Imagine being 60 years old, having spent 50 years of your life serving a goddess that the state now declared never existed, having given up marriage, children, and normal human relationships for a cause that history had judged to be false. The psychological impact must have been crushing. These women had been taught from childhood that they were specially chosen, that their sacrifices were essential to Rome's survival, that their suffering had cosmic significance. To discover that it had all been a political construct, a system of social control dressed up as religious devotion, would have shattered any coherent sense of identity or purpose. But perhaps some found liberation in the collapse of the system that had imprisoned them. Maybe there were former Vestals who, in their final years, discovered the simple pleasures that had been denied to them. Friendship, physical affection, the freedom to make choices about their own bodies and lives. Maybe some of them found love, even in old age, and experienced the human connections they had been forced to forsake. The end of the Vestal institution marked more than just the death of a religious practice. It represented a fundamental shift in how Roman society understood the relationship between the divine and the human, between religious devotion and social control, between honor and oppression. The new Christian empire was hardly a paradise for women. It brought its own forms of sexism and control. But it didn't require the ritual imprisonment of little girls or the murder of women who dared to be human. In that limited sense, the end of the Vestals represented genuine progress, a recognition that true religious devotion couldn't be built on systematic cruelty. The sacred fire that had burned for over a millennium was finally allowed to die, and with it died one of history's most elaborate systems for disguising oppression as honor, torture as worship, and murder as divine justice. But wait. Before you breathe a sigh of relief that those dark days are behind us, let me ask you something. When was the last time you saw a woman publicly shamed for not meeting impossible standards of purity? When did you last witness someone's life destroyed by whispered accusations and social media mob justice? How often do we still see women punished for being fully human? The Vestal Virgin system may be dead, but its ghost haunts us still. Different methods, same psychology. Think about the modern cancel culture phenomenon. One accusation, real or imagined, and someone's life can be destroyed overnight. Trial by social media, judgment without due process, punishment without appeal. Sound familiar? Consider how we still create impossible standards for women in public life. They must be pure, but not prudish. Attractive, but not too sexual. Strong, but not threatening. Perfect mothers while also being career successes. One slip, one moment of humanity, and the vultures circle. Look at how we treat women who step outside prescribed boundaries. Whistleblowers get character assassinated. Assault victims get put on trial. Women who dare to age naturally get mocked and dismissed. The burial chambers are gone, but the psychological mechanisms remain. We've simply digitized the campus sceleratus. The most chilling parallel is how modern systems still use the language of protection while practicing oppression. We're keeping women safe, they say, while restricting their freedoms. We're honoring feminine virtue they claim, while punishing any deviation from narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. This is for their own good, they insist, while systematically destroying women who refuse to comply. The Vestals were told they were the most honored women in Rome, while being treated as sacred slaves. How many women today are told they're empowered, while being subjected to surveillance, judgment, and control that would make those ancient priests proud? Social media has created a panopticon that the Romans could never have imagined. Every woman is constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly one mistake away from viral destruction. The sacred fire has been replaced by the blue glow of screens, but the psychological pressure remains the same. Be perfect, be pure, be what society needs you to be, or face the consequences. And just like in ancient Rome, the women who internalize these impossible standards often become the cruelest enforcers of them. The Vestals, who had been broken by the system, would police younger women with ruthless efficiency. Today, we see the same pattern in how women attack other women for not meeting societal expectations. Internalized oppression masquerading as moral righteousness. The methods have evolved, but the essential function remains: using the promise of honor and protection to justify systematic control and, when necessary, destruction of women who dare to be human. But here's what gives me hope. We're starting to recognize these patterns. We're beginning to see through the beautiful language that disguises ugly intentions. We're learning to ask the crucial questions. Who benefits when women are afraid to step out of line? What systems of power are maintained by keeping women focused on policing each other, rather than challenging the structures that oppress them all? The Vestals couldn't speak for themselves. Their stories were erased, their voices silenced, their experiences dismissed as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. But we can speak. We can recognize the warning signs. We can refuse to participate in systems that demand human sacrifice disguised as social order. So there it is, Rome's darkest secret laid bare. These weren't symbols of divine favor. They were children stolen, broken, and murdered by a system that called torture honor. But here's what should terrify you. This isn't ancient history. The same psychological tricks Romans used? They're everywhere today. Different clothes, same game. We still create impossible standards for women, still punish them for being human, still disguise oppression as protection. The methods change, the control stays the same. Next time you see a woman being held to perfect standards, ask yourself, what's really going on here? Who benefits when women are too scared to step out of line? The Vestals can't speak for themselves anymore. But their story? It's screaming a warning across 20 centuries. Are we listening? What patterns do you see in your own world that echo this ancient horror? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about how we recognize these systems before they destroy more lives. And if this story haunted you the way it should, consider subscribing. Because history's darkest chapters aren't just entertainment. They're instruction manuals for spotting evil dressed up as virtue. The Vestal's fire may be gone, but their warning? That burns eternal. Sleep well tonight, knowing you live in a world where children can't be legally stolen from families to serve gods demanding human sacrifice. But sleep also with understanding that the impulses creating such systems haven't disappeared. They've just found new expressions. The vigilance required to keep them in check is the price we pay for civilization that values human dignity over social order. compassion over control, and the messy reality of human nature over sterile fantasy of perfect purity. And maybe in that vigilance, we can honor the memory of women whose names we'll never know, whose stories were deliberately erased, but whose suffering reminds us that true progress isn't measured by the grandeur of our institutions, but by how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. The Vestal Virgins served Rome's vision of itself as a civilization blessed by the gods. In death, they serve a different purpose, as witnesses to human capacity for cruelty and the eternal need to choose compassion over convention, humanity over ideology, and love over fear. Their fire may be extinguished, but their warning burns on. Don't let it burn in vain.